Now I'd like to shift gears a little bit and start to connect the types of environmental factors I've been talking about so far today, from rising sea levels to rising temperatures to land usage, and try to link those to the main outcome we've been focusing on in this first part of the class, which is violent conflict, civil war. And in this section, I would like to go over some of the main theories related to how the literature has connected environmental factors to conflict. And over the next 6 weeks or so, I'm going to be talking about a number of different environmental and human security factors in more detail and see how they can link theoretically and empirically to conflict. One of those areas in which we'll be talking about a number of different case studies is that of the Sahel, one of the parts of the world that is actually changing the quickest in desertification, drought, and other environmental changes. And this photo is from a joint military exercise that the U.S. had with some Western African states back in 2019. The U.S. has, last time I checked, around 6,000 U.S. Department of Defense troops on various different missions in the Western African region. The Australian military also has a couple of different missions in the region as well, including, the last time I checked, one soldier in Mali. You have others in South Sudan. So the Australian citizens also have a stake in providing security in these areas hard hit by environmental variabilities and increasing anomalous climate conditions and weather conditions. And this week represents the last kind of broad overview topic week, in which in week one I defined the main forms of conflict we're going to be focusing on in this class, civil conflict specifically. In week two, we talked about the more influential economic factors that have been found to be related to conflict. Last week, we talked about political institutions and how different national level political institutions have been found to either make conflict more or less likely. And this week, I want to highlight a couple of general trends linking environmental change and scarcity to conflict. And then in the next section, we'll be breaking that down and looking at several different areas in more detail. Population, when they're in a particular place, when they move with migration, water, food, natural resources, and natural disasters will wind up that second part of the course. And so in this section of the rest of this week, we want to try to start thinking theoretically and linking the previous theories we saw in weeks 2 and 3 to environmental factors. In this class, we have those three main elements: environmental issues, human security issues, and conflict. And this week, we actually take that final step to the most structural of conditions, environmental factors. And these factors are multifaceted, like human security that we've seen so far. In this chart from the World Health Organization, you see a number of different areas in which humans increasingly intensive and Anthropocene level engagement in particular areas are having an effect on direct health impacts, ecosystem-related impacts, and then more indirect relationships up to and including conflict. And conflict is one of those areas in which a lot of people like to talk about the high stakes if we don't do something. And often this is like another area that I focus on with human trafficking, that there are clear normative and moral implications for action or inaction related to protecting certain parts of the ecosystem and our impact on it. And often the rhetoric can get ahead of the evidence. And I think with the new IPCC report that was just released and that we'll be reading later on in the term, there's been a more measured understanding of how how a lot of these relationships can be more indirect than we might otherwise have thought, including in the readings today. So there's been progress, and I think a lot of people are kind of focusing on the complexity and the indirect relationships that a lot of these environmental factors have on conflict, that it's channeled through economic lenses, human security lenses, or political lenses in order to have an effect on the state's ability to prevent conflict, and elites deciding to start a rebel group, and individuals' willingness to actually join. And one of the earliest and most influential works related to linking these topics that I've been able to find was this original 1994 piece by Thomas Homer-Dixon. We're reading the article book, the article version instead of the book, because it's shorter and more concise, and I think it touches on a lot of the main findings that he had in his study of how cases in which they had conflict and environmental scarcities. So these causes that he highlighted in the articles, and we're going to be going over this in the workshop too: greenhouse-induced climate change, stratospheric ozone depletion, degradation and loss of good agricultural land, relating to what I mentioned earlier, degradation and removal of forests, which I also touched on, depletion and pollution of freshwater supplies, which I mentioned has already happened in China and that we're going to be talking about in the Water Week as well, and the depletion of fisheries. That these causes of conflict can be often due to scarcity. And that kind of links to his first expected relationship, hypothesis 1, the simple scarcity kind of war, that decreasing supplies of physically controllable environmental resources will lead to conflict. Excuse me. And that is just as the amount of resources become more scarce, there'll be more competition for it, and that should lead to just a scramble of all against all to be able to control what you can. The second is group identity conflicts. Large population movements caused by environmental stress will lead to conflict. We're going to be getting more into that in later weeks. But as I mentioned before, that this huge move towards urbanization that we saw in that video earlier today, and the movement often due to the fact that labor is no longer needed in the agricultural land, can cause a group identity related conflict because of that movement of people. And then deprivation conflicts. So environmental scarcity will lead to economic deprivation, and disruption of social institutions will lead to conflict. And so there's like a direct relationship with hypothesis 1, an more indirect relationship leading through migration in hypothesis 2, and then hypothesis 3 is more of an indirect relationship as well, leading through economic deprivation and disruption, which should link us to and seem familiar after our discussions in week 2. And the way that I kind of think about it, because I like to bake, is about, you can think of it as the resource pie, that the different hypotheses relate to how the pie is divided. The environmental change shrinks the resource pie. That's a simple scarcity, hypothesis 1. Population growth divides the pie into smaller slices. An unequal resource distribution, which means that certain parts of society get disproportionately larger or smaller pieces, which connects to our income inequality discussion from 2 weeks ago. And we can see some countries have actually gone the other direction as Australia has become slightly more unequal. Brazil's Gini index has actually gone down in recent decades, but from a much higher level. And so it's important to be understanding both change within countries and then comparing countries against each other. In this path diagram from Thomas Homer-Dixon, I showed it in a previous week, and we'll be seeing it in later weeks as well, because I think it does a good job at kind of showing those 3 stages that I showed back in week 1, but providing a little bit more context. So we started with the simplest kind of model with 3 different factors and lines connecting each one, and now we're breaking it up into the sources of environmental scarcity, the effects that has on economics or population movements, and then how that affects conflict, either through opportunity arguments through weak states or through motivations due to grievances at all, right? And so we're going to be looking at a number of these for specific weeks. But rather than focus on that more specifically right now, I want to focus on how his case selection process was useful in trying to explain specific cases and derive really interesting theoretical models from them, but then also to get you to start to think about for your own papers as well, what kind of connections do you want to draw between these general theories of political conflict or resource conflict and to specific cases in general. And he basically selected on both a dependent and independent variable. In his article and as for his books, he looks at cases in which there was environmental scarcity and conflict. And this is something that is often done in a lot of case study research, and it allows us to really delve deeply into how these processes connect scarcity in those 3 different ways that Homer-Dixon talks about on the probability of conflict and actual conflict. But I guess for me, I'm interested to hear your take on the costs and benefits of only looking at cases in which there is conflict and there is those independent factors. What are the benefits and what are the potential costs for selecting on those variables? Because we're going to be talking about the research design aspects of these papers in the workshop and the trade-offs that we have when trying to decide whether an argument is generalizable or applicable to other contexts. So it seems like a bit of a specific methodological question, but I think in our lives, when we try to learn about the world, when we try to make arguments for our own research, it's important to think about, if we're focusing on one specific part of the puzzle, what else could be important? That if there is conflict, but there's no environmental scarcity, how often did those happen? What are the substantive effects? Are these the ones that are the most common, or that have the biggest relationship with other factors? Or what about environmental scarcity but no conflict? How did those states handle those scarcity demands on the state and people's grievances? Why was conflict avoided, right? So, and then the last one would be no environmental scarcity and no conflict. That, by and large, is the most common category. Most states in most years are not in civil war, and most countries don't have the kind of extreme environmental scarcity that we're going to be looking at, both with the anomalies that I mentioned earlier and with the specific factors that we're going to be looking at in the subsequent weeks. So how much can we learn by a simple 2x2 table in which we focus on one part when there is environmental scarcity and conflict versus those in which either conflict is present and the independent variable or environmental scarcity is not there, or when there is scarcity and not conflict? How much do we need to compare across cells versus looking within them? So that's the second lecture question. For the students who are taking this class, please, and you're choosing to finish the lecture questions, I'd be interested to read your take there. And that ends this kind of brief discussion of environmental change and conflict. We're going to be going into more specifics in the next video now and in this second major part of the class that starts next week.